German pilots couldn't believe B-17s with 16 guns until these flying fortresses fell behind. Chapter 1. The Sky's Silent Giant. In the early 1930s, as the world teetered on the brink of another global conflict, the United States Army Air Corps began envisioning a new kind of bomber, one that could fly higher, further, and carry more than anything that had come before. This was a time when aircraft were evolving at breakneck speed, each generation faster, stronger, and more lethal than the last. The concept was audacious. A bomber that could defend itself, deliver devastating payloads over enemy territory, and survive the deadly skies of modern warfare. The result of this vision would become one of the most iconic aircraft of World War II, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The nickname itself, Flying Fortress, was no exaggeration. With a crew of up to 10 men, the B-17 bristled with as many as 16 .50-caliber machine guns, mounted in positions all over its fuselage and wings. From the nose to the tail, every angle had a defensive capability. German pilots, accustomed to facing smaller, more vulnerable bombers, could scarcely believe that a single aircraft could wield such formidable firepower. Yet the Allies knew that the true strength of the B-17 wasn't just in its guns. It was in its design, its resilience, and the men who flew it. The first prototype, the Model 299, made its maiden flight in 1935. And though it crashed during testing due to pilot error, the potential was undeniable. Engineers refined the design, increasing its range, improving its engines, and fortifying the fuselage. By the late 1930s, the B-17 had evolved into a machine capable of flying 2,000 miles with a full bomb load, maintaining altitudes of over 25,000 feet, and returning home battered but intact from missions that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. It was a fortress in the sky, not only in name, but in substance. For the crews who would eventually fly these planes, training was grueling. Pilots learned to navigate by dead reckoning over featureless oceans and enemy territory. Bombardiers practiced hitting targets from high altitudes with mechanical precision, while gunners drilled endlessly on simulators and moving targets, preparing for the inevitable encounters with enemy fighters. Life aboard a B-17 was a mixture of monotony and terror. Long flights over Europe meant hours of staring at endless clouds, broken by the sudden adrenaline of combat. The cold at 25,000 feet was biting. Crews wore electrically heated suits, but even so, frostbite was a constant danger. There was little room to move, less room to relax, and almost no privacy. Yet bonds formed quickly. Humor, camaraderie, and a shared sense of purpose became as vital to survival as skill with the controls or the guns. The early missions for the 8th Air Force were a baptism by fire. Over Germany, the B-17s faced an enemy that had perfected anti-aircraft defenses and fighter interception. The Luftwaffe, initially incredulous at the heavily armed bombers, soon discovered that these flying fortresses could be more than nuisances. They were lethal and unrelenting. In the first encounters, German pilots were surprised at how aggressively B-17 gunners defended their planes. Entire formations of fighters were repelled not just by skillful piloting, but by concentrated fields of fire from well-positioned gunners. The B-17's defensive philosophy was simple: mutual protection. Flying in tight formations allowed overlapping arcs of fire, turning a group of bombers into a moving fortress that was exponentially harder to destroy than a single plane. But the reputation of the Flying Fortress was built on more than just armament and tactics. It was built on resilience. Stories poured in from returning crews of planes riddled with flak, engines ablaze, and fuselages torn apart. Yet somehow, they made it home. One famous tale recounts a B-17 nicknamed All-American that returned from a mission with nearly half its tail section shot away. Yet the crew managed to land safely. These were not just machines. They were floating symbols of ingenuity, endurance, and sheer stubbornness. For the men in the Luftwaffe, facing a squadron of these aircraft was a lesson in humility and fear. No longer could a single fighter pilot expect easy kills. The Flying Fortress demanded respect. The psychological impact of the B-17 on both sides of the conflict cannot be overstated. German pilots, once confident in their air superiority, now faced a new calculus. Attacking a B-17 alone was often suicidal, and even coordinated attacks carried high risks. For the American crews, each mission was a test of nerve. Flying into hostile skies meant confronting flak that could tear a bomber apart, fighters that attacked in waves, and the ever-present possibility that their plane would be the one to fall behind the formation. Falling behind, even briefly, often meant death or capture. Yet the courage of these crews became legendary, and their tales of endurance, sacrifice, and humor in the face of danger became the stuff of legend. It was not just combat that defined the Flying Fortress. It was the way it changed the air war. B-17s enabled strategic bombing on a scale previously unimaginable, reaching deep into enemy territory and striking factories, oil refineries, and transportation hubs critical to the German war machine. Planners had long debated whether high-altitude daylight bombing could be effective, given the risks. But the B-17 proved that precision and perseverance could achieve results. Every mission was a balance of risk and reward, a testament to the courage of crews who knew that their actions had consequences far beyond their own survival. And yet, for all its strengths, the B-17 was not invincible. Stories of planes shot down, crews captured, and missions that ended in disaster reminded everyone that the Flying Fortress, despite its name and guns, was still vulnerable. Losses were heavy, and each mission carried a grim awareness that some would not return. This duality, immense power, coupled with constant peril, gave the Flying Fortress its mystique. It was a machine of war, yes, but it was also a stage for human courage, ingenuity, and resilience. The men who flew B-17s learned to laugh at danger, even when it seemed absurd. Accounts from veterans describe moments of gallows humor, a gunner joking about having too many holes in the plane to count, or a pilot quipping that his target was probably surprised to see a whole flying fort staring him down. These glimpses of humanity, threaded through the relentless tension of aerial warfare, reveal the character of the crews who made the Flying Fortress more than just an aircraft. They made it a living legend. By the time the B-17 had entered full production and combat deployment, it had achieved a rare combination: technological superiority, strategic utility, and a psychological edge over the enemy. German pilots would speak of its guns, its toughness, and its unpredictable courage in almost mythical terms. Allied aircrews, despite losses and constant danger, felt a connection to their machines, a trust that the Flying Fortress would carry them through the storm, if not unscathed, then at least home. As we look back at the early missions of the Flying Fortress, we see more than a bomber. It was a turning point in air warfare. It was the embodiment of American industrial power, technological ingenuity, and the unyielding spirit of its crews. Each mission, each encounter with the Luftwaffe, and each story of survival built the legend that would define the B-17 for generations. The sky's silent giant had arrived, and it was about to change the face of aerial combat forever. The Flying Fortress, bristling with guns, engines, and determination, was not just a plane, it was a testament to what human courage, ingenuity, and teamwork could achieve against overwhelming odds. It demanded respect, inspired awe, and instilled fear in the hearts of its enemies. For the men who flew her, for the engineers who built her, and for the planners who deployed her, the B-17 was proof that a machine could be more than metal and fuel. It could be a symbol, a sanctuary, and a weapon that shaped history. And so as the sun set over the training fields of America, and the skies of Europe began to tremble under the roar of engines, the Flying Fortress took flight, silent, immense, and indestructible in spirit. Little did anyone know that these early missions were just the beginning of a saga that would etch the name B-17 into the annals of war, courage, and legend. Chapter 2. From Targets to Hunters. By the early 1940s, the B-17 Flying Fortress had begun to leave its mark on the skies over Europe. What started as a silent, imposing figure in training fields and test runs now became a symbol of relentless American resolve. Yet for all its firepower and range, the B-17 initially faced a harsh reality. In the early missions over Nazi-occupied territory, the Flying Fortress was often a target, not a predator. Luftwaffe pilots, skilled, experienced, and numerous, treated these early formations with a mix of curiosity and contempt, believing that a bomber, no matter how heavily armed, could not stand against the full might of the German Air Force. They were about to learn a very harsh lesson. The turning point for the Flying Fortress came in the concept of formation flying. Instead of sending individual bombers or small groups, the U.S. Army Air Forces began organizing large formations, sometimes dozens of B-17s flying in tight, V-shaped wedges known as combat boxes. The genius of this tactic lay in its simplicity. By overlapping the fields of fire from multiple bombers, each aircraft could contribute to a defensive wall of bullets. The bombers were no longer isolated, vulnerable targets. They became mutual guardians of each other's lives. To a German pilot diving through clouds toward the expected easy prey, this sudden barrage of .50 caliber fire could be shocking. Entire waves of enemy aircraft were often repelled or destroyed before reaching their targets. Gunners, trained extensively before being sent overseas, became the unsung heroes of this transformation. Each turret, each machine gun mount, was manned by a crew member whose life depended on accuracy, quick reflexes, and nerves of steel. The ball turret gunner, curled into a metal sphere beneath the plane, faced perhaps the most dangerous position. Suspended like a spider in the air, exposed to the enemy, freezing at high altitude, yet capable of turning the tide of a dogfight. Tales from veterans describe gunners calmly counting bullets, tracking enemy fighters, and shouting out corrections to their comrades, all while dodging streams of tracer rounds. It was a ballet of precision and courage, a deadly choreography that transformed the B-17 from prey into predator. The change was not immediate. Early missions over France and the Low Countries were brutal. Crews flew through dense flak, witnessing aircraft around them torn apart, with smoke and fire marking the sky. The Flying Fortress, despite its resilience, was still vulnerable. German pilots adapted quickly, using head-on attacks and coordinated formations to exploit any gaps. But as crews gained experience, they learned to anticipate maneuvers, to adjust altitude and speed, and to rely on each other's firepower. Slowly, the dynamic shifted. B-17s were no longer simply being hunted. They were actively defending and striking back, often surprising Luftwaffe pilots who had underestimated them. The psychology of these missions was a unique blend of fear, adrenaline, and dark humor. Pilots would joke about friendly fire from above when gunners' bullets strayed, or comment sarcastically on the accuracy of flak bursts, while knowing that a single miscalculation could end their lives. Flight engineers monitored engines, fuel, and systems under extreme conditions, their hands frozen in the bitter heights, yet moving with practiced efficiency. Bombardiers, locked on targets hundreds of feet below, became mathematical wizards, calculating wind, altitude, and drift while under fire. The crew operated as a single organism, each member vital, each life intertwined with the others. One illustrative example came from a mission over Bremen in 1943. A formation of B-17s, numbering over 40, faced repeated attacks from Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf FW-190s. At first, chaos reigned. Pilots described clouds of tracer fire, explosions around them, and the terrifying realization that a single hit could ignite a bomb or tear the fuselage apart. But as the formation pressed forward, gunners coordinated their fire, pilots maintained the combat box, and eventually, the Luftwaffe attack faltered. Several enemy aircraft were destroyed, and remarkably, most of the B-17s returned to England. The mission, initially a nightmare, ended as a testament to the efficacy of teamwork, training, and the inherent toughness of the Flying Fortress. It was during this phase that the B-17 earned a psychological edge over its adversaries. German pilots began to speak in hushed tones about the flying fortresses, noting the almost impossible odds of taking them down without heavy losses. What had once been seen as lumbering targets were now agile hunters in their own right, each bomber a deadly mix of guns, altitude, and tactical discipline. Even when isolated, a B-17 could still inflict serious damage, making the cost of engagement extremely high. But the transformation from target to hunter also required innovation on the American side. Pilots and tacticians developed new flight techniques, coordinated timing, and radio communication strategies that allowed formations to operate like living defensive networks. Lessons were learned through trial and error, often at the cost of aircraft and lives, but the payoff was enormous. The B-17 was no longer just a bomber. It had become a weapon capable of defending itself while delivering precise strategic blows deep into enemy territory. Beyond the battlefield, these lessons also shaped morale and culture among the crews. Shared hardship, the thrill of survival, and the pride of mastering such a complex machine fostered a unique esprit de corps.
Veterans would later recall moments of levity, singing in unison to pass the time, creating playful rivalries between gunners, or joking about how many holes it takes to keep a flying fortress honest, humor acting as a shield against the constant pressure of combat. This combination of bravery, ingenuity, and camaraderie became the hallmark of B-17 operations. The transformation of the flying fortress from prey to predator had long-term consequences. It validated the strategy of high-altitude daylight bombing, demonstrating that bombers could both survive and impose strategic damage without relying solely on nighttime cover. It forced the Luftwaffe to divert resources, rethink tactics, and recognize the formidable skill and resilience of American airmen. And for the crews themselves, the lessons learned in those skies, discipline, trust, adaptability, and courage, would define them for the rest of the war and for the rest of their lives. By the end of 1943, B-17s had firmly established themselves as hunters in the skies over Europe.
While losses were still significant, the psychological and tactical shift was undeniable. No longer passive targets, flying fortresses actively controlled the engagement, exacting a toll on enemy aircraft and shaping the aerial battlefield. They had become symbols of American industrial power, technological ingenuity, and human courage, teaching the Luftwaffe that the era of easy victories was over. As these early missions concluded, one thing became clear. The Flying Fortress was not just a bomber, it was a statement. It told the world that the United States could project power across continents, that technology and human skill could combine to produce machines capable of both offense and defense, and that courage, training, and mutual support could turn even the most vulnerable into hunters. The transformation from target to hunter marked the beginning of the B-17's legendary status. German pilots who had once underestimated the aircraft would never forget the withering firepower, the discipline, and the indomitable spirit of the crews who manned these flying fortresses. And for the men of the 8th Air Force, every mission, every maneuver, and every successful return became a chapter in the story of how ordinary men, flying a marvel of engineering, could face a seemingly invincible enemy and emerge not just alive, but victorious. Chapter 3. Blood in the Skies. By 1943, the skies over Europe had become a vast and deadly chessboard, and the B-17 Flying Fortress was at the center of nearly every game. These were not simple bombing runs. They were massive, meticulously planned operations that required coordination among dozens, sometimes hundreds of aircraft. Every mission was fraught with danger. Anti-aircraft fire, commonly referred to as flak, rained down in iron bursts from the ground, tearing holes in fuselages, puncturing fuel tanks, and sending shrapnel through anything that stood in its path. Above, swarms of German fighters lurked like shadows, ready to exploit even the smallest lapse in formation or concentration. The air was a war zone in 3 dimensions, and the Flying Fortress crews had to survive it or die trying. The true test of a B-17 crew's mettle came when planes fell behind the main formation. A single bomber, isolated from its protective wall of fire, became a floating target, and history shows how deadly that could be. Some pilots called it the thin red line, the boundary between survival and annihilation. Those who lost altitude or struggled with engine trouble often found themselves facing multiple enemy fighters simultaneously. The speed, coordination, and accuracy of German pilots meant that a lagging B-17 could be hit within minutes. Yet even in these dire moments, crews demonstrated ingenuity and courage. Gunners fired relentlessly. Pilots executed evasive maneuvers honed in training, and engineers worked frantically to keep faltering engines running. Survival often hinged on sheer skill, quick thinking, and a measure of luck. One of the most harrowing examples occurred during a mission over Bremen in the spring of 1943. A formation of over 40 B-17s faced relentless attacks from Luftwaffe fighters. At first, the American bombers advanced in tight formation, their overlapping fields of fire repelling some of the initial attacks. But during the approach to the target, a storm of flak erupted. Explosions shredded wings and fuselage alike. Several bombers were hit and began to lag behind, immediately becoming magnets for the fighters. One B-17, nicknamed the Phoenix, took hits to its engines and tail, yet its crew refused to bail out. The pilot, a man barely 25, executed a series of sharp, banking maneuvers, all while the gunners returned fire with deadly precision. Against all odds, the battered bomber managed to limply return to England, landing with half its tail missing. Stories like this spread quickly among crews, cementing the Flying Fortress's reputation for toughness and the courage of its crews. The crews themselves were a study in human psychology under extreme stress. Imagine sitting in a metal tube, thousands of feet above the earth, with freezing temperatures, deafening engine noise, and enemy bullets tearing past your cockpit. Each man had a specific role: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, and a variety of gunners, including the notoriously exposed ball turret gunner. The ball turret was a small spherical compartment beneath the fuselage, so cramped that the gunner had to curl into a fetal position to operate it. Suspended hundreds of feet above the ground, he was essentially alone in the sky, with nothing to shield him from the cold or the enemy. Yet it was here, in the most perilous spot, that some of the bravest men in the war operated with remarkable precision, saving not only their plane, but often others in the formation. The bombing missions themselves required a combination of mathematical precision and almost ritualistic procedure. Bombardiers, armed with the Norden bombsight, a marvel of pre-digital engineering, calculated altitude, wind speed, and drift to drop their payloads on factory rooftops, rail yards, or bridges, all while under fire. A single miscalculation could mean missed targets, or worse, bombs striking civilian areas. The pressure was immense. Yet, despite the danger, crews developed routines and rituals to cope. Some sang songs to calm their nerves. Others recited prayers or jokes to each other over the intercom. Humor became a survival tool, a way to humanize the inhuman. The Luftwaffe quickly learned that attacking a formation of flying fortresses was no simple task. While early German pilots underestimated the B-17's defensive power, repeated encounters proved that even a single bomber could unleash a lethal hailstorm of bullets. German fighter pilots found themselves not only dodging flak from the ground, but also trying to navigate an aerial minefield of overlapping machine gun fire. The result was often catastrophic for the attackers, with losses mounting against the supposed easy targets. Veteran accounts from both sides describe moments where the sky seemed to explode with tracer fire, smoke, and fireballs, a terrifying yet awe-inspiring sight, where bravery and skill could tip the balance between life and death in a matter of seconds. Yet for all its firepower and formation tactics, the B-17 was still vulnerable. Weather, mechanical failures, and fatigue often caused planes to fall behind. These stragglers became the nightmare of every formation leader. Fighter pilots knew that targeting a lone B-17 offered the best chance for a kill. One illustrative incident occurred during a mission to Regensburg. The formation was hit by a sudden thunderstorm, scattering several bombers. Isolated, one plane was attacked by multiple FW-190s. The gunners fought valiantly, downing 2 attackers, but the aircraft sustained critical damage. Miraculously, the crew managed to limp across hostile territory, landing hundreds of miles from their base. The story became emblematic of both the peril and resilience inherent in every mission. As the war progressed, the Flying Fortress also became a tool of psychological warfare. German civilians and soldiers alike began to associate the drone of B-17 engines with impending destruction. The mere sight of a squadron approaching over industrial cities struck fear into hearts, while the American crews felt the weight of that responsibility. Every mission carried not just the technical challenge of flying and bombing, but also the moral burden of war. Decisions had to be made about early missions in 1942 and 1943. Saw up to 25% of aircraft lost on some sorties. Yet even with these staggering odds, crews continued to volunteer for more missions, driven by a mixture of duty, camaraderie, and an unshakable belief in the mission. Stories abound of men returning to their planes after narrowly surviving previous missions, determined to fly again. These acts of courage forged legends that would endure long after the last flak burst faded from the skies of Europe. Among the most remarkable aspects of these missions was the innovation under fire. Pilots and crew developed on-the-fly tactics to evade fighters and flak, sometimes improvising maneuvers that would later become standard procedure. Engineers repaired damage mid-flight, sometimes in freezing conditions that made movement almost impossible. Gunners adapted to changing enemy patterns, predicting attacks with almost instinctual timing. The Flying Fortress was no longer just a machine. It had become a platform for human ingenuity, courage, and adaptability, a true partner in survival and combat. Even amidst the horror, moments of human connection shone through. Crew members shared cigarettes, letters, and stories of home, maintaining a thread of normalcy in an otherwise extraordinary situation. Pilots joked about the friendly skies as bullets and flak rained around them, and gunners quipped about the accuracy of German marksmanship, finding laughter in the tension. These small acts of humor and resilience were as essential as guns or engines, keeping morale alive and reminding crews that they were more than soldiers. They were humans facing impossible odds together. By the end of these grueling campaigns, the B-17 had earned a reputation not just as a bomber, but as a machine that could endure punishment, protect its crew, and execute missions with precision under conditions that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. The aircraft's durability, combined with the courage and skill of its crews, fundamentally shifted the balance in the air war over Europe. German pilots, who had once approached flying fortresses with overconfidence, learned to respect them, adapting their tactics, yet often at great cost. The B-17 had transformed the sky into a battlefield where bravery, coordination, and mechanical resilience dictated survival. In retrospect, these blood-in-the-skies missions were a crucible, forging the legend of the Flying Fortress. Each sortie combined engineering marvel, tactical innovation, human bravery, and sheer stubborn determination. From stragglers facing multiple enemy fighters to entire formations repelling waves of attacks, the narrative of the B-17 became one of endurance and heroism under extreme conditions. The aircraft was not invincible, but it amplified the courage, skill, and resourcefulness of those who flew it, turning ordinary men into legends, and turning the sky into a theater of both tragedy and triumph. The legacy of these missions is multi-layered. Strategically, the Flying Fortress proved the effectiveness of high-altitude daylight precision bombing. Psychologically, it instilled fear in the enemy and confidence in its own crews. Technologically, it demonstrated the potential of integrating defensive firepower, formation tactics, and crew coordination into a coherent combat strategy. And personally, it showed how human ingenuity, teamwork, and resilience could thrive even in the most extreme and lethal environments. As the smoke cleared over bombed cities and damaged Luftwaffe squadrons retreated, one fact became undeniable. The B-17 Flying Fortress had emerged as a dominant force in the skies. What had once been the hunted was now, in many ways, the hunter. Its crews, forged by fire and iron, had turned the tables on an enemy that had once regarded them as vulnerable.
Yet the risks remained. The skies were still perilous, and every mission reminded everyone involved of the razor-thin line between life and death. By the time these campaigns concluded, the Flying Fortress had etched itself into history, not just as a bomber, but as a symbol of courage, determination, and the extraordinary achievements of human beings facing unimaginable challenges. The blood spilled in the skies was not in vain. It created a legacy that would inspire future generations of aviators, engineers, and ordinary people alike. The story of the Flying Fortress is, above all, a story of resilience, ingenuity, and the indomitable spirit of those who dared to fly into danger time and again for a cause larger than themselves. Chapter 4. The Fortress Falls Behind. Despite the formidable reputation of the B-17 Flying Fortress, the reality of aerial warfare remained harsh and unforgiving. Even the most disciplined formations, bristling with guns and crewed by seasoned veterans, could not escape the inherent vulnerabilities of the skies. When a flying fortress fell behind its formation, whether due to mechanical failure, battle damage, poor weather, or human error, it became a solitary target, exposed to the full force of the Luftwaffe. The difference between survival and annihilation could be measured in seconds. Formation discipline was the backbone of the Flying Fortress's defense. Pilots were drilled extensively in keeping their assigned positions, maintaining altitude, speed, and relative distance from other bombers. The overlapping arcs of defensive fire from the combat box were only effective if every plane stayed in line. A single gap could compromise the entire defensive network. Yet under the stress of combat, this discipline was difficult to maintain. Turbulent weather, evasive maneuvers, or damage could cause a bomber to lag, and even minor deviations had catastrophic potential.
For a plane that fell behind, the fortress became vulnerable, stripped of the protective wall of fire that had made it so deadly. The psychological strain of being the lagging bomber was immense. Crews knew the danger, yet they had little choice but to push forward. Pilots described the feeling of being alone in a living nightmare, with tracer fire arcing through the sky and enemy fighters circling like vultures. Gunners, often under direct attack, had to focus intensely on shooting accurately while maintaining communication with their pilot and fellow crew members. Every decision mattered. Evasive maneuvers, throttle adjustments, even the timing of a gunner's burst could spell the difference between life and death. For many, these missions tested not just skill, but sheer mental resilience. One of the most infamous examples of a B-17 falling behind occurred during a raid on Regensburg in August 1943. A formation of nearly 100 flying fortresses, accompanied by escort fighters, set out to strike the Messerschmitt aircraft factories deep in Bavaria. The weather was poor, with turbulent clouds obscuring visibility and making formation keeping difficult. Several bombers, including one nicknamed Lady Luck, experienced engine troubles and began to drop behind. Within minutes, Luftwaffe fighters attacked, exploiting the isolation of these aircraft. Tracer rounds stitched the air around them, and flak bursts shredded the sky. The pilot of Lady Luck executed a desperate series of evasive maneuvers while the gunners returned fire, managing to down a fighter before sustaining further hits. Despite this heroism, the plane was critically damaged. The crew survived through skill, luck, and sheer determination. But many others in similar situations were not so fortunate. These instances highlighted the dual nature of the B-17. Nearly indestructible when part of a formation, yet highly vulnerable when isolated.
The German Air Command quickly analyzed these patterns, recognizing that attacking stragglers offered the best opportunity for success with minimal risk. FW-190s and BF-109s adapted their tactics, coordinating attacks to intercept lagging bombers at optimal angles. Head-on approaches, diving runs, and coordinated group assaults exploited the blind spots of even the most well-defended flying fortress. The result was devastating for those caught alone, but it also pushed American crews to innovate further. Evasive maneuvers, engine management, and gunnery coordination became matters of life and death. Pilots learned to anticipate enemy tactics, often improvising mid-flight, in ways that would later be formalized into doctrine. Gunners developed techniques for prioritizing targets under pressure, focusing on the most immediate threats to keep their bomber in the air. Engineers improvised repairs in freezing conditions, managing fuel, hydraulics, and engines under fire. Each surviving straggler became a case study in human ingenuity and endurance, illustrating that the Flying Fortress's reputation rested not solely on its design, but on the courage and skill of its crews. The toll of these experiences was immense, both physically and emotionally. Crews faced the constant possibility of death, capture, or severe injury. Frostbite, hypoxia, burns, and shrapnel wounds were common, and the mental strain of repeated missions left deep marks. Yet amidst this chaos, camaraderie and humor persisted. Pilots joked about the lonely sky blues. Gunners quipped about being target practice for the Luftwaffe. and engineers found ways to lighten the tension with sardonic commentary. These small acts of humor, repeated mission after mission, were essential coping mechanisms, providing psychological ballast in an otherwise relentless environment. Historical records are filled with stories of heroism under these circumstances. One notable example involved a B-17 that fell behind during a raid on Bremen. The pilot, realizing the peril, executed a series of banking maneuvers that would have been impossible under normal conditions. The gunners, working in perfect synchronization, shot down 2 attacking fighters and damaged several others. The plane sustained massive structural damage, yet every crew member survived, and the bomber returned to base. These stories illustrate the extremes of courage and skill required when a flying fortress fell behind, turning a potentially fatal situation into a legendary tale of survival. But not every story ended with a happy outcome. Many crews were lost to the skies, their planes never returning from missions. The high-altitude daylight raids that had defined the B-17's tactical advantage also made them vulnerable to concentrated enemy fire. When a bomber was separated from its formation, it faced the full might of German defenses alone. In such moments, the bravery and skill of the crew were often insufficient to guarantee survival. Memorials, letters, and accounts from survivors preserve the memory of these sacrifices, ensuring that the human cost of strategic bombing is never forgotten. The lessons learned from these losses were critical to the evolution of aerial tactics. American commanders adjusted mission planning, emphasizing strict formation discipline, improved escort fighter support, and contingency procedures for lagging aircraft. Crews received enhanced training in emergency maneuvers, engine troubleshooting, and coordinated gunnery. The B-17, once seen as an invincible machine, was now understood in its full complexity. Powerful, resilient, but still reliant on the human element for survival. The flying fortress was a fortress only when its men acted in concert, when discipline, skill, and courage fused into a single entity capable of withstanding the onslaught of enemy fire. The human stories behind these incidents are what give the flying fortress its enduring legacy. Veterans recount moments of fear, ingenuity, and compassion. Crews would share rations with injured comrades, stabilize fires with makeshift methods, and maintain morale even as the plane shuddered under enemy assault. Letters home reveal the tension between terror and duty, illustrating how ordinary young men confronted extraordinary circumstances. Humor, rituals, and shared storytelling became lifelines, a way to assert humanity in an environment designed to strip it away. One of the most poignant examples involves the final moments of a B-17 nicknamed All-American. During a mission over Germany, the bomber fell behind due to engine damage. Surrounded by fighters, the crew executed maneuvers that would have been textbook in any training manual, yet the plane was critically hit. The pilot ordered the crew to bail out, but only after ensuring that each man had a chance to escape. The bomber crashed into the countryside, leaving behind a legacy of bravery, coordination, and selflessness that exemplifies the ethos of every Flying Fortress crew. The vulnerabilities revealed when flying fortresses fell behind did not diminish their reputation. Rather, they humanized it.
They demonstrated that even the most technologically advanced war machines rely on human skill, judgment, and courage. Every loss prompted refinement of tactics. Every successful evasion became a case study in aerial warfare, and every act of heroism contributed to the growing legend of the B-17. By the end of these missions, it was clear that the Flying Fortress had transformed aerial combat, not merely through firepower and armor, but through the extraordinary resilience of its crews. The planes that fell behind, the crews who fought against overwhelming odds, and the lessons learned from each engagement all contributed to a richer, more nuanced understanding of the air war.
The B-17 was no longer just a bomber. It was a platform that amplified human courage, a testament to ingenuity under pressure, and a symbol of the extraordinary lengths men would go to protect each other and achieve their mission. The Flying Fortress's story during these perilous missions serves as a reminder. In war, no machine is invincible, and survival often depends on adaptability, teamwork, and the indomitable human spirit. The lessons learned in these skies would echo through every mission thereafter, shaping strategy, tactics, and the legacy of one of the most iconic aircraft in history. Chapter 5: Legacy of the Flying Fortress. The war in Europe had ended, but the echoes of the skies lingered long after the last B-17 touched down. The Flying Fortress, which had once been a terrifying, almost mythical figure to German pilots, had proven its worth and carved its place in history. Yet its legacy was not measured solely in bombs dropped or enemy planes destroyed. It was measured in the men who flew her, the missions that tested their courage, and the indelible mark she left on both warfare and human memory. For the crews who survived, the return to civilian life was not always easy. Many carried the invisible scars of combat, memories of comrades lost, nights spent in freezing cockpits, and the constant awareness of mortality. Veterans recounted nights when tracer fire cut through clouds, when anti-aircraft flak shredded their planes, and when split-second decisions saved or doomed their lives. They remembered the thrill of evading fighters, the silent tension of approaching enemy territory, and the camaraderie forged in impossible circumstances. Letters home and memoirs reveal a duality, the joy of survival intertwined with grief for those who never returned.
Humor, once a necessary tool for coping in the skies, became a thread that connected past to present. Stories told in bars, veterans gatherings, and classrooms, preserving the humanity that had carried them through. The B-17 itself became more than a machine. It became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. Engineers marveled at its durability. Historians chronicled its role in strategic bombing. And educators used her story to illustrate the interplay between technology and human skill. The aircraft that had dominated the skies over Europe now dominated the imagination, appearing in books, documentaries, and later, films. Every dented fuselage, every missing tail section, every scarred turret told a story of survival against overwhelming odds. The Flying Fortress was a testament to what could be achieved when engineering excellence met human bravery. Strategically, the impact of the B-17 was profound. It validated the doctrine of daylight precision bombing, reshaping air campaigns and influencing post-war aviation. Cities and industrial centers that had once seemed untouchable were vulnerable to high-altitude raids, and enemy forces had to adapt to the threat posed by a formation of well-defended bombers. Losses were heavy, but the cumulative effect of missions disrupted supply lines, crippled production and forced the enemy to divert resources to counter the threat. In this sense, the Flying Fortress contributed not only to tactical victories, but also to a broader shift in the dynamics of war. A shift in which technology, strategy, and human courage intersected in unprecedented ways. The men who flew B-17s carried these lessons into their post-war lives. Some remained in the military, contributing to the development of the U.S. Air Force and training future generations of pilots and engineers. Others returned to civilian careers, applying the discipline, focus, and problem-solving skills honed in the cockpit to industries as diverse as aviation, engineering, and business. Many became storytellers, preserving the narratives of their missions and ensuring that the heroism of their crews and the sacrifices of those who did not return would not be forgotten. Veterans associations and reunions became living archives where history was not only studied, but lived and experienced through the memories of those who had survived. The Flying Fortress also left a legacy in technology. Its design principles influenced post-war aircraft, particularly in areas of structural durability, crew ergonomics, and defensive firepower. Lessons learned from formation tactics, gunnery coordination, and long-range bombing missions informed both military strategy and the engineering of future bombers. The aircraft's influence extended beyond the battlefield, inspiring innovations in civil aviation, cargo transport, and aerial reconnaissance. In essence, the B-17 became a bridge between the era of World War II aviation and the technological advances of the Cold War and beyond. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Flying Fortress was its human story. Each plane was a microcosm of courage, teamwork, and sacrifice. Pilots navigated through flak and fighters with skill and nerve. Bombardiers calculated complex trajectories under duress. Gunners held their positions in freezing metal turrets, facing the immediate threat of death with steady aim. Engineers kept engines running in impossible conditions, and radio operators maintained communication amidst chaos. Together, these men transformed the Flying Fortress from a piece of machinery into a living entity, capable of surviving the worst that war could throw at it. Their stories, captured in memoirs, interviews, and oral histories, remind us that technology alone cannot triumph. It is the human spirit, ingenuity, and courage that give machines their true power. The legacy of the Flying Fortress extends even to the moral and philosophical dimensions of war. Strategic bombing, the very missions that defined the B-17's career, has been the subject of debate and scrutiny. Questions about civilian casualties, the ethics of precision versus area bombing, and the human cost of aerial warfare continue to provoke discussion. Yet within these debates, the heroism of the crews remains indisputable. They faced extraordinary danger with professionalism, skill, and courage, embodying a commitment to duty that transcended fear. Their legacy is one of both technological triumph and human endurance, offering lessons that reach beyond history into the realms of leadership, decision-making, and resilience. Museums around the world preserve the memory of the Flying Fortress. Restored aircraft, such as the famous B-17 Memphis Belle, serve as tangible reminders of the stories we have recounted. Visitors can walk through the cramped fuselage, peer into the ball turret, and imagine the bravery it took to man these positions. Exhibits include personal effects, letters, and photographs, connecting the mechanical with the human. These spaces allow contemporary audiences to experience a fraction of what crews endured, ensuring that the lessons of courage, teamwork, and sacrifice are passed on to future generations. The cultural impact of the B-17 is also evident in literature, film, and art. From war novels to documentaries and Hollywood productions, the Flying Fortress has inspired generations of storytellers. Her image, bristling with guns, engines, and determination, is a symbol of resilience and audacity.
Authors have chronicled the missions with minute detail, capturing not only the technical challenges, but also the human emotions that defined each sortie. Films have dramatized the camaraderie, fear, and heroism, bringing the stories to life for audiences who never experienced the skies of Europe firsthand. Art and photography preserve moments of beauty amid chaos, from formations flying against the sunrise to damaged aircraft limping home under fire. The Flying Fortress thus occupies a unique space, a machine, a symbol, and a repository of human history and emotion. And yet, the most compelling legacy of the Flying Fortress is the men themselves. Survivors carried the lessons of teamwork, courage, and resilience into the post-war world. They became teachers, engineers, and storytellers, imparting their experiences to families, communities, and fellow veterans. Each life preserved and each story told added layers to the rich tapestry of history that the B-17 represents. The human connection is what elevates the Flying Fortress from a marvel of engineering to a living legend, a testament to what ordinary people can achieve under extraordinary circumstances. As the world moved forward into the mid-20th century, the Flying Fortress continued to serve, not only in military training and post-war exercises, but as a beacon of innovation. Her design informed subsequent bombers, and her story inspired generations of aviators. The lessons of survival, coordination, and courage under fire were passed down, not just in manuals or military doctrine, but in the very culture of aviation. The B-17 became a bridge between the past and the future, linking the heroism of World War II airmen with the evolving technology and strategies of the modern era. In the end, the legacy of the Flying Fortress is a story of convergence, technology and humanity, fear and courage, loss and triumph. It reminds us that even the most formidable machine requires the hands, minds, and hearts of those who operate it. It teaches that survival depends on teamwork and ingenuity, that heroism often manifests in ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and that the mark of true legend is not only in what is achieved, but in the stories preserved for posterity. Walking through a restored B-17 today, one can almost feel the ghosts of the past, the hum of engines, the tension in the turrets, the camaraderie of men bound together by mission and peril. These machines, once instruments of war, now serve as memorials to human endurance, ingenuity, and courage. The Flying Fortress is more than metal and bolts. It is a testament to what humanity can achieve when pressed to the limits. A soaring symbol of determination etched into the history of the skies. And so, as we conclude the saga of the B-17 Flying Fortress, we are left with a story that is at once technical strategic, and deeply human. It is a story of a silent giant that dominated the skies, of crews who turned fear into resolve, and of a legacy that transcends war itself. The Flying Fortress reminds us that history is built not only by machines, but by the people who dare to fly them, and that courage, ingenuity, and sacrifice echo far beyond the clouds in which they once soared.